Hi, it's such a shame that you all didn't have the opportunity to go and to look at the site of this competition. So I want to use the opportunity to introduce you some of the knowledge of the region and hoping that it will help you to make your design. But let me start with a short introduction. My name is Martin Probst. I'm an architect and an urbanist, originally from Germany. I work today for a company called MLA Plus in the Netherlands. I'm an urban designer. I'm working on regeneration projects, a lot of them in the Greater Bay Area and in Shenzhen. Our company is called MLA Plus, and it was founded in the early 1990s here in Europe, in the Netherlands. We are architects. We build a lot of housing and public buildings, but our projects start often really early in working for the government and for developers on master plans and on urban design on sites. Since about 15 years, we work also in China, and also there we work on master plans that often focus on how open spaces and buildings work together. And then our architecture takes these ideas into construction. I'm often asked what connects my work here in Europe with my work in China. And I think we realize the differences become smaller and smaller and smaller, especially with the Greater Bay Area in Shenzhen. In both of the regions, the economy is pushing towards a new era. Both of the regions are pushing forward with new industry. And for these industries, the talents, well-educated people are really important. And these people, they look for a certain quality of life in cities. And they look for, apart from good education for their children, healthcare, they look for affordable and new housing. So all of these are topics that we're working on both here in Europe and in China. And especially Shenzhen and the Greater Bay Area is pushing forward into really a new era of development in the moment. And your project actually is one of the projects that could make really a big contribution. So what will I talk about today? My lecture is called Lingnan, Grow on the Southern Land. And I think it needs a little bit of explanation, this term. So here you are, the Pearl River Delta. Hong Kong on the bottom right, and then the area consists of a huge actually delta area. And one of the really traditional features of the Pearl River Delta is what you see here on this image. It's a fish dike pond system. So the area is so low-lying that water has been a really, really important part of this region. And when you drive through the region today, a typical scene will look like this. You see some farmland and you see a city emerging behind it. And you will start to discover these kinds of places here. So what are they? They're urban villages. These are a way for urbanization built over that farmland. And they are the sign of not the traditional, but the modern Pearl River Delta. They're a place where a lot of people live, actually. About 50% of the population in cities like Dongguan and Shenzhen live in these kinds of urban villages still. And as I said, they are really a sign of the modern Pearl River Delta, which over the last generation has been the location of great urbanization and of development looking forward. The big question is, do these kinds of cities that have been built still have a relationship to the location where they're actually built? So in order to introduce this discourse and to introduce the term Lingnan, we need to zoom out a little bit. On this map, you can see quite clearly a big geographic difference between the north of China and the south of China. The north of China being much more flat, and then the south of China actually with big mountain ranges separating it, and especially the Pearl River Delta in the south has a very, very different orientation than, for example, the region in Beijing, with big geographical and big cultural differences. So if we zoom a little bit in, the term Lingnan refers to an area around the cities of Guangzhou or the provinces of Guangzhou, Guangxi, the island of Hainan, Hong Kong, Macau. And it's in the Chinese term, Lingnan actually refers to a range of mountains on the north of the Canton province, and it refers to the area located south of these mountains. So Lingnan means south of these mountains, the area south of these mountains being something special, actually. So Lingnan is a geographical and a cultural concept, and it refers back to actually a landscape, nature, and climate as the dominant elements in this region. When you go there, you see a very, very lush, intense vegetation, subtropical climate, and a landscape that relates to flat areas of delta, and then going up onto high mountain peaks of 1,000, 2,000 meters right beside it. And what this region has realized is that climate conscious design can actually bring out the best of this region. So traditional buildings have done something quite special in the way gardens and architecture is integrated. They always play together, actually. There is no separation between inside and outside. And then what happened in the early 20th century is that some early modern projects still have these kind of features. You can still recognize that play of outside and inside belonging to each other. But then many of these characteristic elements of that region have been lost. And I want to explain a little bit what are these characteristic elements in this lecture. Why they have been lost is quite clear. There's multiple reasons for it, but in general, its modernity has driven other values, actually, technology, urbanization, the speed of construction has meant that there was just less time and also less emphasis for these traditional concepts that dominated the way this region developed. So what is Lingnan in detail? Actually, an image like this exemplifies it quite strongly. It is not an architectural style. It is a way of how buildings and open spaces have been laid out and designed to work together with this incredibly lush nature and with the climate of that region. There are three phases of development. So in the 18th, 19th century, it was discovered that actually the south of China, the Lingnan area, actually has a own characteristics than the north of China. And this was also the time when China opened up and when first architects studied abroad and learned about regional characteristics, and they started to define that term. Then in the time 1950s to 1980s, it was a time where, well, they call it the mature period of Lingnan architecture, so where these characteristics were still translated into contemporary architecture. But then actually since the 1990s, since the modern opening of China, some of these features got lost in this big wave of internationalization. There is a number of interesting architects. Maybe for the Chinese colleagues students that also study here, it'll be quite interesting to look a little bit deeper into these proponents of the Lingnan style. I'll show some of the works and some of the projects that they have done. I won't go into the great detail of what the principles of the architecture and the gardens are. You can look at that later. But I want to highlight 7 principles that we have worked out in our office. So the first principle is a very special layout of how villages in the region are constructed. And the reason why I put the sun and the cloud and the rain up there is that all of these principles have a very strong relationship to either the heat, the hot summer months, or the strong monsoon rain, and how interplay between these two can make living and construction in this area actually bearable. So villages have been laid out in a way that in the predominant wind direction, there was often a lake, and the wind was going over this lake, cooling the air down before they went through the alleyways. So these villages, this pattern of grain still exists. Some of these lakes still exist in this region. You see it in this image here. What was a natural lake in this particular village now has just become a pond, but the orientation is still there from the main direction of water, and then the air is cooled down before it's blown through the wind alleys of these villages. The second principle is a principle that really focuses on architecture being a really integral part of the garden design. So they always belong to each other. And they're multi-layered ways of how you can weave inside and outside together in traditional architecture and also in modern architecture. You see that later. This is how a famous park in the middle of Guangzhou looks like. And these are the tea houses you can see in the back. The rooms are open. They look out over that pond on the right, that the boat tea room is actually open, so the air that goes over the lake can flow throughly in a breeze through that tea house. Also, the parks itself of these three particular lake parks in Guangzhou have been beautifully designed to integrate water into a park design. So these are water parks actually in the middle of the city, solving some of the flood issues that the region has during the heavy monsoon rains. And they really drove a certain strong architectural or landscape architectural identity of a park. And then within these parks, you have the famous tea houses that have these open tea rooms that look out over the park, a certain way of how you approach them to make them really an integrated part. There is no distinction between the design of the landscape by a landscape architect and the building of the architect on the other side. They're really considered together as one in one principle. A really important element of Lingnan buildings is the hall. So these are key buildings that are located with the strongest orientation to the pond, to this cooling pond. And the way buildings are organized often are also that they have a central hall that is open, that is higher than the other rooms. So the air can flow over the pond through the open louvers that you see in the bottom image into the tallest room. The air can rise up and then go out again through the roof. And this traditional principle was then translated into modern architecture as well in the 1950s during this mature period of Lingnan style. So these were buildings that were built by, architects that were inspired by the modern period of architecture in the 1920s, 1930s in Europe, in the States, that started to study in Paris or maybe went to the Bauhaus and went to universities in the US after the war. And they brought the principles of modernity back, modern architecture, but actually they translated them and overlaid them still with the Lingnan principles. So even in a big exhibition hall like this one here, you would have open corridors where the air can breathe through. Or the central library building of the university in Guangzhou in its original state was a library that had actually an open air central atrium space that was naturally ventilated by the air blowing. The fourth principle is then how you protect buildings against the sun and at the same time actually also against the rain. So the sun is very, very intense in the south of China, much more than in the north. So how can we make the climate inside the buildings and in front of the buildings comfortable? As a traditional example here is an arcade house that is very common in in Guangzhou, for example, but that is also a common typology all the way down through Vietnam, through Singapore, Malaysia. You have these kinds of houses with a corridor, an arcade in front, where during the heavy monsoon time, people can walk on the pavement, dry and protected by the rain and by the sun. In modern architecture, this was translated into the brise soleils that came with modernity, and then behind it, not closed windows, but open windows where the air can breeze through the classrooms or the hospital rooms, for example, in this medical science building. And often the buildings have an open atrium in the center, where the air that goes from the outside, the hot air that comes in from the outside, goes through the open spaces of the building and then can rise up in the middle, and also a space that can collect the rainfall that comes through the roof and has a pond at the bottom that will cool down the air again. I've put here in an example from Penang in Malaysia, and it's a Chinese villa built by a Chinese tradesman that came from Guangdong province. And here you see this courtyard. So it's an open air courtyard in the middle. You can see the water pond that is now dry, but if there's heavy monsoon rain, this pond will be filled with water. And on the side, you can see how the living spaces are actually open to this central courtyard. It's a principle that we also know from Islamic architecture to make this courtyard and spaces open. It's a climate conscious design with actually quite simple solutions of just how our spaces are arranged. And then in detail, these buildings have then, for example, not closed walls, but they have louvers where the air can go through, shutters where the air can breeze through, to have this ventilation from the hot outside through the building spaces, cooled down over the pond in the courtyard and going and then warming up and rising up again. So really an architecture that facilitates natural ventilation. And these principles, again, were brought in and still remembered in the early modernist architecture projects that were built in that region, like this one here, or then in the really first high-rise buildings that were built in the 1980s. So when the south of China opened up to investment, mainly from Hong Kong businessmen, these architects from the university in Guangzhou, most of them actually, these Lingnan architects were working, and they brought these ideas then into the big scale modern construction as well, with an open central atrium, with open tea room spaces that now don't look out onto the park, but they look out onto a central green an atrium in this building here. Which brings me to the sixth principle, which is the ground floor of building. So in order to maximize the ventilation, it's quite common that the ground floor of buildings is actually open. It's unused, so the air can really go through that under the building. And it's a beautiful way of how to integrate indoor and outdoor spaces together. So you see this also here in these drawings again, and the pictures again, actually in the small picture in the middle. Is that now an interior courtyard, an interior room? Is that a corridor, or is this an outdoor space? Really, the boundary really blurs. And then we were quite fascinated when we did our research to discover these drawings from the 1970s, where clearly this is a modern building, but actually the architects were very conscious of how to open up the ground floor, how to have the big trees, how to have the ventilation still flowing through, to have this permeability and the natural ventilation still integrated in the early modern city there in China. And the last principle in general is, I would say, a lightness in architecture. We don't look so much at big monumental buildings like we know them from, the capital in Beijing, or how we know them also from other regions around the world. Actually, the architecture in the Lingnan region, it is quite light. And this is an image that I put in here, actually, that shows it doesn't matter what the style of the building is. This is just simple concrete. It's not even designed by an architect, probably, but it is a lightness of structure that actually allows this beautiful integration of the mellow climate around it with the inside of the building or these covered spaces. There's often a comment that it's hot in the south of China. Well, it's hot if you're in the direct sun, but actually, if you're in the shade under a roof like this, and if this is a space where the breeze over that pond makes the air move, and you have a light breeze going around, it's very, very nice to be there almost all months of the year. It's quite a beautiful experience. So this lightness of architecture was then translated into really contemporary buildings. This is one of the main buildings in the university in Guangzhou that has this layered feeling of inside outside, a very, very light building that blends in the pond with the landscape that goes through these buildings. But the same thing also works in commercial buildings, like this one here. It's in a new business district. It's an office building. But if I show you the images on the next slide, actually it becomes maybe very clear what I mean. So this is the main circulation between the buildings. It's a covered corridor where you can walk dry. You don't get wet in the monsoon rain. I used to, just by accident, I was there when it was kind of pouring down like hell. But actually you can walk between these buildings beautifully outside. This is 25, 28 degrees. You can walk short sleeve. In heavy rain, you don't get wet. You walk along there. The courtyard is designed in Lingnan style as a courtyard that has this beautiful lush vegetation, but that also has retention areas for water that look beautiful when they're dry, but they actually have enough capacity to start to collect that water when it rains a lot. So this was a moment when the monsoon rain just started, and you see the puddles forming on this pebbled area here in front of us. And that pond has enough capacity to hold actually quite a huge amount of water before it's slowly released again to feed the plants or into the municipal system. And then the office lobbies of these buildings have this natural ventilation. So there's a huge zone in front of it. Of course, at some point on the left, you see you go into air conditioned and where the lifts are. But the main office lobby is actually outside. And this is something that is beautifully possible in the south of China, in this Lingnan region. Well, this was actually the end. 7 principles. I hope they can help you to maybe transform or think about the building and your project you're working on in a local way. Maybe they help you a little bit to understand what you unfortunately couldn't experience on the site visit. I want to recommend you 2 books to look at and to read as well to finish my lecture. One on the left side, if you maybe can understand a little bit of Dutch or a little bit of German, that is a very, very interesting book to read, written by a person called Roland Reiner from Vienna. He was the city architect of the city of Vienna, and he had the great opportunity to travel to China 2 times in the 1970s before the modern urbanization started. And he published this book, which is very, very fascinated by the way farming and the land is used in a garden way and not in an agricultural way. It's a beautiful book also if you don't understand the language. Go on Google, you can find copies of it. They're not very expensive. And then on the right side, The Great Leap Forward. So Rem Koolhaas, when he was at Harvard, he published a book early 2000 about the Pearl River Delta. I think it's a must read for anyone who does a project there in that region, just to understand what the urbanization is all about. Well, I hope this short lecture gave you a little bit of insight into what the climate and the culture of the south of China could maybe offer into your project. I think there's a beautiful relationship with the content of your work, bringing agriculture into an urban building as well. So I hope you enjoyed. This is Martin Probst from M&A Plus. I wish you good luck for finishing your project. Bye.